And thank you for being with us for webinar 5, implementation of cognitive rigor in teams. This is the 5th part of a 5-part series, so the final webinar. And today we're going to talk about exploring the use of rigor in collaborative teams, examining the steps required to implement rigor in teams, and analyzing and evaluating Cogno, a software tool that guides collaborative teams through the process at a very high level. And so to begin, I'm going to be using polls everywhere again. If you would text Brandon D575 to 37607, we'll begin with our very first poll, which is, what are some of the best qualities of teams you've been a part of? So about a minute for this one. Okay, so we have a lot of really great words here, with success being in the middle of all of them, but kind of that safe place that you can make connections with others and share decision making in terms of the actions that are going to be taken later. So success at the center. We know that collective efficacy based on Hattie's work in visible learning has a 1.57 effect size, or 2 or more years of learning, when teachers believe that they can make a difference. So that piece of information is very helpful. This is number 2 in Hattie's work of what makes a difference for students in learning. And there are 4 conditions of collective efficacy. The first is that teams have to commit to transparency in practices and results. They have to be transparent with each other. They have to make a decision before they begin that this work is about helping students, and that data that they may see does not reflect them, but their students' reactions to instructions. And therefore, they should have no judgment around this, except how do we take action? Teams must create a climate of continuous improvement and non-judgmentalism. So not judging each other or each other's data, or even self-judgment about what's going on in the process in collaborative teams. And teams must focus on specific practices. We've said in the past, collective capacity building is the only way to make true achievement. So the specific practices that teams need to focus on should be focused on instruction above all else. And 4, teams must agree on the evidence of growth. And this is Fullen's work from 2016. We know that the whole purpose is that we have our teacher teams down at the bottom, math, ELA, science, it's a secondary configuration, that it should get to the building level so they can celebrate their wins, but also look at what are some of the administrative conditions that made a difference in those teams being successful. Then how does that information get to the district leadership team so they can collect all of the wins, all of the opportunities for growth, and say, how do I support each of the buildings in this process? The buildings then supporting each of the teams in the process. So when we look at implementing rigor in teams, there are several particular focus points that we want to look at. First, begin with prioritizing standards. So when we're implementing rigor in teams, standards have to be prioritized first, and we're going to be using rigor as part of that process. 2, we're creating authentic norms in groups, identifying the rigor of priority standards, then create success criteria matching the rigor. And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. 4, create formative and summative assessments using various appropriate levels of rigor. I always say try to create your summative assessments first and then work backwards from there. And that in our formative assessments, we're also asking some affective type questions, not just cognitive. 5, evaluate the rigor of instructional strategies for solid tier 1 instruction. That's going to include reteaching. And 6, create pre-tests to measure mastery based on what students do know, not what they don't know. So in this first one, begin with prioritizing standards. We've talked about the power of prioritizing, and that it's about how time is spent, how rank order is used, how multiple data points have to contribute to this prioritization process. And that as we're talking about this, rigor is at the heart of how we choose our prioritized standards. In creating authentic norms and groups, we're looking at each member of the team having a role, and that the norms are initiated by the group. So in other words, it's not okay for an administrative group to say, okay, I'm going to give this group their norms. That's not how norms work. Norms that are authentic are created by the team itself, and the team leader references the norms in every single meeting just in case anybody needs to modify those. But over time, it becomes so efficient that norm time is minimized. So why are norms so important for any team success? I'm going to give you a minute to text this in, about 1 minute, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so we have a lot of really great words here. We can see that safety is in the middle of all of this, and that is why it's so important that when teams get together, you can really look at those that are successful and not successful based on what kinds of norms they've generated. So safety becomes really important so that people have a safe place to be able to say whatever they want to say. A lot of teams will say, you know, this meeting is like Vegas. What happens here stays here. So just looking at that safety piece as part of the process is so important. The third part of implementing rigor in teams has to do with identifying the rigor of priority standards and then creating success criteria matching the rigor of the standards. So here we have this 4th grade standard. We identify that it is at DOK level 2, skills and conceptual understandings. Bloom 4, analyze, and we see that in order to explain the differences in points of view in a text and different perspectives of the characters, we have to categorize, compare, contrast, those types of things. So when we write our success criteria, we might say in order to explain the differences in the points of view in a text, we must be able to describe them, compare them, and contrast them. And this becomes the basis for creating success criteria. As we get to the 4th part of implementing rigor in teams, we're looking at the assessment process. So how those formative and summative assessments are set up at the appropriate levels of rigor in a trajectory. So it's very important to be thinking that the simple formative assessments leading to complex formative assessments allow various levels of cognitive rigor, so that when we start to get to that target level of rigor at simple summative and complex summative, students have had a safe place to fail along the way. We may look at this And I want to emphasize again how important it is that the ELA standards are those standards that come back over and over again, and that we have a longer period of time to do our scaffolding. So it may be in September, we're at DOK 1, Bloom Level 2 Understand, and that by March, we're getting over to Evaluate and Create at DOK 3 and 4. Whereas in math, it might be, instead of all those various months, in various weeks. So we're trying to look at formative and summative assessments that are matching the target levels of rigor. And again, so critical to be asking affective types of questions. How are you connected to this? Why do you remember this? What in life is connected to this particular learning in this standard? In the fifth step, we're evaluating the rigor of instructional strategies. So you can see we started with standards, we moved to assessment. Now we're at the instruction piece. And this was one of the strategies that I used before. Again, so very important to be using names when we're talking about instructional strategies because it makes them more replicable. So we look at this, students have to choose 3 words as they're reading part of a text. They talk to each other about that text, and then they use those words in order to summarize. Now, what we know about the level of rigor is that we're moving along a trajectory where we can see how this is used. And again, this is my strategy review chart where we have the primitive. We're going to be looking at the cognitive rigor next, but what do I need to remember? Time it, pair students, have students use the words from top of the box for summary. It is a during teaching, during learning strategy, and comments are for the teacher. I'm going to use this to read a new article on growth next time. So here's our various levels of rigor that this particular strategy covers. Starts over at DOK 1, Bloom Level 2, recall and reproduction and understand. It moves over to DOK 2, Bloom Level 2, and it can and has the potential to get to DOK 4, Bloom Level 5, evaluate. If we're verifying the reasonableness or evaluating the relevancy, accuracy, or completeness of information from multiple sources in using this particular strategy. So why should teams spend more time discussing instruction than any other topic in the PLC or teacher team process? I'm going to give you 1 minute to respond to that. Okay, so we have a lot of things coming up. Instruction is what's most important for learning. It's critical. It's the actions we take, the actions of the teachers. And so that's why spending time on instruction more than anything else becomes really critical in that PLC teacher team process. The sixth thing that we're looking at is creating pre-tests to measure mastery based on what students know, not what they don't know. So when we're looking at that information, we're looking at, this may be the target level of the standard, but I may want to assess some of these other pieces as students are trying to get information and the teachers trying to get information about where students are in terms of their level of mastery of the standard. So here's some various levels of rigor in math. We notice at the easiest level, we're measuring DOK 1, Bloom 3. What's the difference in rice between $50 and $35? At DOK 2, Bloom 2, explain the steps you'd follow to show the percentage of increase or decrease. DOK 2, Bloom Level 3, Jose bought a car for 14,000. Here's application, right? Jose bought a car for $14,000. He ended up selling it for 5,000. 5 years later, what's the percent of decrease in the sale price? And then here's that Bloom level 2, DOK2 Bloom level 3 at the summative level. Mary has a dress for $34 that ordinarily costs $50. What's the percent decrease in the sale price? So notice the parallelism between the first and second configurations, and that we're trying to look at various levels of rigor so that we are assessing where students are before they begin learning. Also helps us with time. Now in Cogno, what we know and have configured for you is a software tool that's going to walk you through this process. So notice there's a question at the very beginning of Cogno as you begin stage 3 that says, what conditions do we need personally and as a group to examine various student work while feeling safe enough to show both positive and negative results to the whole group? Remember, if we go back to teacher efficacy, and one of those conditions, it's about being transparent, it's about being non-judgmental. So what behavior from my colleagues would be most desirable and least desirable to make this time productive? These are just several questions to get the norms rolling. That the group is creating the norms based on these questions. We could also ask the question here, how would we resolve conflict as a group? So there's another thing to think about as part of how we configure norms. And so in the software, they would just write these and they would have them to pull up for the all the subsequent meetings they'd have afterwards. As we start looking at various standards that we're trying to assess along the way, Cogno will pull up any of the standards. They just check any of them that they want to be looking at for that particular assessment, formatively or summatively. And then it's going to say, how many sections of this class do you teach? If I'm an elementary teacher, probably just one. But at the secondary level, I could have as many as 4, 5, 6. And then it's going to say, how many total students are in each class? And then how far would you like to subdivide each of those groups so that you're providing an action item? So we have to be careful here not to overdo it. Most people choose 3. But in some cases they choose 2. And when they do choose 3, it looks like this, that we have, oh, actually this group chose 4, my bad. All right, but they have advanced mastery, mastered standard, progressing to mastery, emerging evidence of mastery. And they're gonna say, okay, how many students are there in each of these categories, in each of these 4 categories? And what Cogno is gonna do is it's gonna create a SMART goal for every class. So it takes the baseline of however many students are proficient or above. There's that 94%. And it looks like 4% of students were close to proficient or far to go. And so that's how it's setting the SMART goal for them. The next part is the focus on instruction, where we're looking at what affective and cognitive strengths do each of the groups have? What are the opportunities for growth? Then most importantly of all of these, what instructional intervention or enrichment is going to be provided to differentiate instruction? So that at the tier 1 level, we have reteaching that's occurring that's meeting the needs of students. So we're not jumping them to tier 2 and tier 3. We then take whatever that level of rigor is, we write the success criteria for the instructional strategy that we're going to be addressing based on those opportunities for growth. And then at the very end, we're going to say, okay, what are we going to be focused on in our next meeting? As a consequence of all of these pieces of Cogno, at the very end, it says, how has the building or district instructional leader responded to the instructional choices and success criteria? And there's a drop-down menu there. It says, was it email? Was it paper slip? Was it a phone call? Was it how it, and then what was the response? So they can keep their responses. Then you hit save and finish. And there it's guided you all the way through the process at a very high level so that teachers can spend most of their time talking about instruction, which is the most important thing in that PLC or teacher team process. So many thanks. Thank you for attending our webinars. Hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, please shoot them to me at Dr. B. Dubeck at evolutionalliance.education. Take care and be well.